Poverty in the Depression. Welcome, class. Now, I know some of this is going to be review for what we'd done previously, but I do think it's necessary that we take a look at how it is that poverty began in the 1930s and how it spread. All right, let's continue. So the stock market crash and how it led to an economic crash. So as we reviewed last class when we discussed the economic stock market crash of 1929, a sudden drop in stock prices was due to the mass selling, right? As stockbrokers attempted to unload massive amounts of stocks bought on margin. Millions of dollars in people's personal assets were lost during this crisis. Those who bought on margin, right? Those who had bought stocks with loaned money now often had to repay the difference to their brokers. So people began flocking to their local banks, looking desperately for their money. Problem is, the banks themselves had often either invested this money out on the stock market or had used up almost all the money in their physical possession, giving it out in loans, often to other banks, sometimes to banks overseas. We'll get to this in a moment. People began to make what they called a run on the bank, attempting to get their money out. As more and more people demanded their money out and it became obvious the bank didn't have any money, the bank was forced to close. When this happened, people lost everything. So other patrons not connected to the stock market or to the bank run often woke up one day to find out that their bank had gone under and that any money they kept stored in the bank was gone. This would have long-term psychological impacts on those who grew up during this generation. Many of you may have may have grandparents or great-grandparents that grew up during this time. Many of them often will display several to us would seem strange habits, such as squirreling money away in what would seem like odd places. Many older Americans are known to hide money inside of books or under the mattress or things like that. And it's a reaction to this type of phenomenon. A sort of distrust in banks, the idea that you never keep all of your money in the bank. Certainly don't keep all your money in one bank, because if that bank goes under somehow, you could lose it. So always have a little bit squirreled away somewhere in cash. So the business collapse. So how again does a loss of the stock market lead to a loss anywhere else, right? How do we get from Wall Street to Main Street? Well, the first problem is a loss of economic confidence. Remember, investors who provide money to companies, as well as the CEOs of companies, get nervous, just like anybody. And when these stock market prices drop, they find themselves fearful that the economy is unstable, right? If you're an investor, if you're putting money into stocks, you expect to make money. That's your goal. If you don't think you're going to make money, you don't invest. So in order to do this, you need confidence that when you put money in, you're getting money out. More money than the money you put in. If it seems likely that isn't going to happen, people simply don't invest. And because of this, many times companies found themselves without a lot of capital. Furthermore, as CEOs got nervous, they often wanted to cut their costs. This led to layoffs. This led to jobs terminating the employment of many of its people. It's not quite firing in the traditional sense because the employees aren't losing their job due to them doing anything wrong, just due to the fact the company doesn't want to or says it can't maintain their employment any longer. Now, because of this, joblessness begins to increase. We also see a rise in foreclosures on mortgages, right? People who bought their house on installment plans, on mortgages, suddenly couldn't make mortgage payments, and they lost the house. Those who invested in, those who were making rentals suddenly couldn't make rent. And more Americans find themselves homeless. These homeless came to take up residence in small villages of shacks, which were called Hoovervilles. Almost every major city had one. And the latrine trenches in these villages, the ditches on the sides and borders of the camp where people would relieve themselves, these became known as Hoover Villas. As you might imagine, Herbert Hoover's inaction in the economy made him a very unpopular man. The homeless farmers often became migrant workers. Since they already knew a great deal about harvesting and growing crops, many of these men began working as migrant workers, traveling from place to place, harvesting the crops of other growers. Many other individuals took to the rails as hobos, traveling the nation, looking for employment or food or something. So let's talk about Hoover. You all remember him from our previous installment as the man who battled Alfred E. Smith in the election and who went on to become one of America's presidents. Hoover would have the distinct reputation as a one-term president. We haven't had many of them in our history, so let us take a deep dive and see why exactly Herbert Hoover was not much beloved by the American people. So his biggest issue stems from the idea of limited government. Now, this is an idea that many Republicans held in Hoover's time, and it's one that many Republicans continue to hold quite dear. And the notion of limited government is quite simple, that, as Thomas Jefferson said even before the founding of the Republican Party, but when he founded the Democratic Republican Party, he said, "The government which governs best governs least." Right? AKA, if your government is going to do a good job at being a government, it needs to do very little. And many Republicans today continue to believe that. And Herbert Hoover in the 1930s definitely believed that. He didn't see it as the government's place to intervene in the economy. The economy had to get itself up and going again. The government couldn't get involved. That was Herbert Hoover's philosophy. And it was very much in keeping with traditional capitalist orthodoxy, which held that a government's role in the economy ought to be minimal, mainly protecting private property or enforcing contracts. These types of activities were the ones that were considered proper to a government. Otherwise, no dice. So Hoover really found himself in a position where he really wasn't supposed to do anything, at least as far as he was concerned. And yet the public desperately needed aid. The public desperately wanted something done. So what did Herbert Hoover do? Well, he decided to set out and create what was called the trickle-down economy. Trickle-down is a term that a comedian used. He didn't call it this. And the idea is that relief is given to the wealthy, and then it's going to trickle down to the rest of us. And it involved tax cuts to corporations. So let's take a look at trickle-down economics. The idea is that this is a way to stimulate the economy when things get bad. And it's a very hands-off, non-interventionist style of affecting the economy because it doesn't involve the government directly getting involved in the economy at all. It's not providing relief, it's not even giving any money. It just does it by cutting taxes, right? So the government isn't giving anything. It's simply deciding not to take something. So from Hoover's perspective, this is something a government can still do, and so he does it. Now, the idea is very simple. You reduce taxes on business interests and the wealthy. The idea, this allows extra cash flow for economic investment, right? In other words, the theory is, as one political cartoon put it once, the issue is simple. You give the poor money, they eat. You give the rich money, they invest. And that, to some extent, was the logic, right? That if you wanted to turn the economy around, give the money to the rich people. They, in turn, will either start more businesses or invest in the expansion of currently existing businesses. Because of that, that will create more jobs, give more people employment, they'll have money, and the economy will expand that way. Now, the issue is, this is rarely effective, and the reason why it doesn't really work is because during times of uncertainty, companies and individuals tend to save rather than spend, right? A private individual isn't going to risk all of their money just to try to make other people's lives better, right? They're not going to expand their company and provide jobs if they don't think they're going to make money. If the economy doesn't look stable, they're simply not going to risk it. They'll hoard up the money that they've been allowed to keep in from tax cuts, and they'll save it for a rainy day. They'll save it for another time when maybe the economy will be in better shape. And then we arrive at the problem of the bonus army. The bonus army remains one of America's most interesting little chapters. So, at the conclusion of World War I, the U.S. promised to pay veterans a bonus check in the year 1945. However, by 1932, with the Depression in full swing, unemployed and often homeless World War I veterans marched on Washington to demand the bonus be paid early in light of the poor economy. President Hoover refused to pay 12 years ahead of schedule. Many destitute veterans simply stayed on in a Hooverville located in D.C. The burning of the Bonus Army camp. Now, hundreds of veterans remained in D.C. well into the winter. They had nowhere else to go, many of them. Many were homeless. All of them were out of work. And so they simply stayed. Now, many had taken to residing in or living in unused public buildings during the crisis. And this had led to a standoff or to an issue of violence between members of the Bonus Army and local D.C. Metro Police. Following this incident, Herbert Hoover ordered the Bonus Army camp dispersed. General Douglas MacArthur was ordered to clear the men away. Acting in concert with two other future generals, Dwight D. Eisenhower and George S. Patton, MacArthur and the regular United States Army cleared out the Bonus Army camp. The tents of the camp were torched with flamethrowers, and tear gas and light tanks were used to clear the veterans away. Many described it as a shameful moment in United States history. Veterans who risked their lives on the battlefields of Europe for American democracy were being driven out by tanks and tear gas by their own government when they dared to request aid. It was a shameful moment, and one that would lead the country away from Herbert Hoover and into the camp of Franklin Delano Roosevelt.